Well, thank you for coming back this afternoon as we spend a little bit of time thinking about walking with others who are going through grief. This is intimidating, isn't it? I mean, if I think about the question I get asked more than any other question wherever I go or I speak or I'm doing something, it's this. It's like, what do I say? What do I do? And we're so afraid we're going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. We're so afraid we're going to be that person that the grieving person goes off and says, I can't believe what she said, right? And we so don't want to do that. And so I'm going to give you 10 pretty quick things, 10 things grieving people wish you knew. And I'm going to try to work through them pretty quickly that hopefully we might even have some time for some back and forth, some questions. So forgive me if I talk real fast, but I'm hoping to maybe some of you have something really burning you would love to ask. And so hopefully we will be able to get to that. So number one, the first thing that grieving people really wish you knew is that they don't expect you to have words that will fix it, but that they do want you to say something. Now, see, I'm hoping this first one takes off the pressure that some of us have felt, the pressure that has kept us from approaching that person who is grieving, because we so want to come up with something that's insightful and meaningful and memorable and sympathetic and helpful. We are fixers. That's our nature. And there's a sense in which we kind of want to be the person that says something to the grieving person that makes them go, terrific, now everything is better. Everything is brighter. So I hope it takes the pressure off as you think about interacting with someone who's grieving. Know that there's absolutely nothing you can say that fixes it. And so if you don't have to do that, then you don't have to be so afraid of approaching. What the grieving person wants is not for you to say something that fixes it, not for you to say something that gives them the perspective that they've never thought of yet. The reason you go and interact with them and what they really want from you is to come alongside them in the midst of their loss, recognizing that there are no words that can fix it. That is a great companion in grief. Someone who interacts with them humbly, almost stands before their loss with humility, not expecting that their words could fix it, not trying necessarily to fill up the silence, not offering advice, not offering a story of someone else, but just saying something. And the truth is, you do have to say something. Let me tell you this is very important for you to know about grieving people, that when they've experienced a loss, it's almost as if a hurdle, you know, that kind of hurdle that you see on a racetrack, on a racetrack. You see this hurdle, and for them, what they feel is that a hurdle has come up between them and pretty much everyone in their world, everyone they know. And until the loss is acknowledged in some way, that hurdle stays up. You can't just go on talking to them about something else and expect the relationship is going to be normalized until the loss is acknowledged. I so well remember the fall, maybe 6 months after my daughter Hope died, and I was in the carpool line at my son's school, and this friend who had a daughter who was born maybe 3 to 6 months before Hope walked up to my car in the carpool line, and I rolled down the window, and she said to me, Nancy, I just have to tell you that every time I see you, I don't know what to say to you because it's so hard for me that my arms are full while yours are empty. And she said, I just haven't known how to kind of break through that or what to say to you. And I said, you just did. You know, the hurdle came down. She didn't say anything that fixed it for me. She did express to me a recognition. I mean, what she did was she honored my loss. She came humbly before it and esteemed my loss and expressed her own sorrow and her own awkwardness, that her arms were full. And, you know, it wasn't anything brilliant, didn't fix everything, but the hurdle came down, and the hurdle stayed down after that. So just recognize that you must overcome the awkwardness to engage at some point. And until you do, there's going to be a hurdle. And maybe it's something as simple as saying, I'm so sad with you. You can always say that, and it's always appreciated. The other thing you can say that you can always say is, ready for this because it's really profound, you're going to get your money's worth here. I don't know what to say. Doesn't seem very helpful, does it? But you know what? Once again, it comes alongside rather than talking down to, and expresses that you recognize that this is an enormous loss that you don't anticipate your words could fix. All right, so that was number one. Number two, grieving people wish you knew, and I alluded to this, they don't want to hear a story about a loss you've experienced or a loss someone else has experienced. Now, my husband and I have a theory about this because in the midst of our losses, we learned pretty quickly that that's what people tend to do. They see you at church, they see you at a restaurant, and, you know, I often feel sorry for people who interacted with us in the midst of our experience, especially when Hope was alive, because they wanted to say something encouraging, and here was this diagnosis that she was going to die. And it must have been pretty hard to know how to approach us or know what to say to us. And what we oftentimes found, and we've found all in the years since then, people, I think their brains, our theory is their brains go on like a computer search, kind of like a Google search. They're looking for a match. Right? So the brains go on a search for a match, someone they know who has had something similar happen, or something they have experienced. And why do they do that? Their motives are good. When you do that, your motive is good. What you're wanting to be able to express is a sense of empathy. Like, I've been at a place like this before. I've entered into your sorrow enough to have a sense of what's going on. Or I've known someone else who has gone through this and observed it enough that I know what's going on with you. But here's the thing about telling the story about your loss or about someone else's loss. We say it because we think it will be helpful, and I just got to tell you, it won't be. It won't be. And why is that? First of all, sometimes those stories come with unasked for advice, and in the midst of loss, most of us are not looking for advice. But the other thing it does, it's like, here's our loss, and it's so big, and it's taking up so much space in our heart, and so much space in our mind, so much space in our life. And there's a sense in which you tell your story or someone else's story, what you're asking basically is that we take our focus off of our own loss, and we put it on this other person. Maybe we even get the sense that you think we should be sorry for them or reach out to them, and maybe at this place in our lives we just don't have space or energy for that. Or we put it on you, and we seem to feel that maybe you are thinking that our loss is exactly like yours and that you know exactly how we feel. And sometimes we even say that, I know how you feel. Well, the impact of that is to say to that, what that person hears is, your loss isn't really all that special. It's not that big of a deal. This is very common. I've been here. Other people have been here. And so what it does is it tends to diminish that person's loss, making it very common and ordinary, rather than elevating that person's loss. So when we're interacting with someone who's grieving, our goal is always to not diminish, but to elevate. And we do that by listening rather than talking as much as we might tend to fill up the awkward silence. And by esteeming their loss, not allowing ourselves to diminish it in any way. Number 3, grieving people wish you knew that you don't have to be in their inner circle of friends to be a welcome companion in grief. Have you ever thought this? You know, maybe it's someone, maybe you're in a large church and it's someone you might wave on the street, but you're not in their close friend group, and you hear that they've heard of a loss, and your thought pattern can be 2 things that might keep you from seeking them out to intersect with them in the grief. First of all, you think they want their privacy. I don't want to invade their privacy. Or second, you think, you know what, I'm not really one of their close friends. And they probably really only want their close friends to be around them in this hard, dark time. And so we stay away. Well, I have hardly ever met a grieving person who didn't have a story both of feeling disappointed about the people who are around them close who disappeared. Like, they didn't know how to handle it. They didn't know how to be a friend to them in this hard, dark place. So some of the people they thought would be here and the people we're thinking will be there, maybe some of those have disappeared. So I've never met anyone who doesn't have a story of someone they thought would be there in the hard, dark time who disappeared. But also, I've never met anyone, a grieving person, who didn't also tell me about people who weren't in their close circle of friends, who entered into their life in the midst of loss and how much it meant to them. I can't tell you, David and I host these weekend retreats for couples who have lost children called respite retreats. And we have this one session where we're just kind of inviting all kinds of conversation about difficult aspects of going through a loss. And we generally always get to this point of dealing with the friends who have disappointed you. And oftentimes it can turn into a real grousing session about people who have failed them. But then I ask them this question: have there also been people who showed up for you that weren't your friends? And it's like this joyous sense of remembrance of people who showed up comes over them. And all of them are like, yes. Now, the reality is some of those were people who were in their life for a short time, maybe just during that hard time. And others of them became their new, dearest, closest, cherished friends because they were the people who shared this intense time of life with them. So don't assume that other friends are coming around them and that you wouldn't be welcome because you don't know them well, because that's just not the truth. One of my best buddies, Katie, we were walking in the park the other day, and she told me about this mutual friend whose mother died, and she saw something on Facebook whose mother died. And Katie and I aren't really that much in the world of this person anymore, and she thought about all these 20-somethings that this woman so faithfully disciples and this church that she's in, and she thought to herself, okay, all of these people are going to be flooding to her house now that she has made it public that her mom has died. But she thought to herself, well, I'll just at least stop by and take her a little something. So she drives over to her house. She shows up. Nobody is there. And our friend has had to book a flight immediately. Her mother died suddenly, and she's got to get there to be with her dad and plan a funeral. Nobody's there. And our friend is in so much grief, she cannot think straight about packing for this trip. She doesn't know how long she's going, all of that. And so Katie, she's like, I'm good at packing. So you sit there on the bed. And Katie went into the closet, and she said, okay, just walk me through the days, and I'm going to pack for you. Because my friend, in the midst of her sudden loss and grief, couldn't even think straight. But it was a real lesson in that sense of, you think they're going to be surrounded by somebody else. And she showed up. She was glad let me tell you, our mutual friend is never going to forget who showed up on one of the hardest days of her life. And Katie didn't have to have any brilliant things to say. She's had to show up and do something she does good, which is pack and just be there right there with her. Number 4, grieving people wish you knew that if they cry when you bring up the person they love who has died, it's not because you made them sad. See, that's another reason we don't want to say something, because we look at that person who went through a loss and we think to ourselves, you know what, they seem like they're having a good day today and they seem happy, and I don't want to make them sad. And so we don't bring it up. But here's the thing, sadness is kind of like a computer program that's running in the background, and it's always running right there. And maybe they are having a good day, but I promise you, there may be a few exceptions to this, but I haven't met many. They're really wishing that someone would talk to them about the thing that is heaviest on their heart, the most significant thing in their life. They're longing to hear the name of that person who died. They're longing to talk about the hardest thing. And if they cry, it's not because you made them sad. It's that the sadness that was there, always running in the background, as you've brought up this thing that matters to them more than anything else, you have, in a sense, given them permission to and help them to release some of the sadness that was already there, that they're keeping zipped up tight because they fear that people are walking on eggshells around them and that it's going to be really awkward if they cry. And when you bring up the person they love who has died, and you don't get scared off when tears begin to flow, when you don't begin to say, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brought it up, but instead, maybe you shed your own tears. Or maybe you show by your body language, or as you lean in and listen, that you feel honored that they would share with you and feel free to shed tears with you about that person who died. They are so grateful for it. So don't be afraid that you made them sad. Understand that you gave them the gift of talking about the one topic they really want to talk about, and gave them the opportunity to release their sadness. And just as an aside on this one, here's the other thing you need to know about grieving people is they hate small talk. I said that we had a respite retreat, I guess not this weekend, but the weekend that, and I made that statement about, don't you hate small talk? And like a roar went up there. It was like, yes. And, you know, they have to go to these holiday events or these various things, and many of them would say they have lost their tolerance for small talk. Do you wonder why they don't want to come to maybe your event? Is it just that they're sad? It's that they can't bear small talk anymore. And they also fear all those new people that they will meet who will say, well, tell me about your family, right? So don't be afraid you made them sad when you bring it up and they shed tears. Number 5, grieving people wish you knew that they are not going to call you if they need anything. So many times we say to people, I'm here, and we mean it. And we say, please call me if you need anything. And we mean it. And we really hope they'll call, because we want to help them in some way that meets a real need that they have. But here's the thing, what they really need is someone to come over and clean the toilets, because they've got a lot more company than they usually have. And what they really need is for someone to go to the grocery store for them, because it's unbearable to walk through the aisles of the grocery store and see things they don't have to buy anymore, and to fall into a pile of tears there in the grocery store. What they really need is for someone to say, you know what? I'm going to mow your lawn every week for the rest of the summer because I know you just don't have much energy to do it. So instead of saying, call me if you need anything, what they need is for people around them to figure out what they need and just do it. Figure out how they can help them in a meaningful way, and either tell them or ask them, could I start coming over every Thursday morning? I have Thursday mornings free, and I've been trying to figure out how I could help. Could I come over every Thursday morning and do your laundry? You see, nobody's going to call you and say, will you come over and wash our family's dirty underwear? I mean, nobody's going to do that. But when someone says, this is the way I would love to serve you in the midst of your sadness, I'd like to come over every Thursday and do that. Could I do that? Do you hear the difference of identifying something specific you could do and either just doing it or asking if they could do it, and giving that general call me if you need me, because they're not going to call. Number 6, grieving people wish you knew how much they long to keep hearing their loved one's name. In this book I recently wrote called What Grieving People Wish You Knew About What Really Helps and What Really Hurts. The way I put it together was I created an online survey that it really had 3 questions. I asked, what's something someone has said to you or written to you that was meaningful or helpful or memorable? What's something someone did for you that was meaningful, helpful? And then 13, what do you wish people knew about your grief that you sense they don't know? And overwhelmingly, you can't believe how many people talked about how much they want people to know, how much they want to keep hearing their loved one's name. I mean, think about it, especially if it was someone who was in your home. How many times a day did you say or write that person's name? This is the person you miss so much, who is so much on your heart and mind. And what often happens after that person dies is nobody wants to bring it up. Everybody thinks, oh, that'll be uncomfortable. When what you're really longing for is to know that you're not the only person who misses the person who died. You're not the only person who's still thinking about the person who died. So to say the person's name who has died, it's like a balm to the grieving person's soul. And it doesn't have to be especially emotional or weird. It can be something as simple as, we went out for sushi last week, and I was thinking about how much Paul loved sushi and the good times we used to have when we'd go to that sushi place together. And I just want you to know, every time I see a sign for sushi, I think about him. And I really miss having him here to eat sushi with me. I mean, did that feel awkward or hard? No, it doesn't. But oh, what a balm to the soul of the person who lovingly misses that person who has died. Number 7, grieving people wish you knew how much they would enjoy hearing a story about your experience with the person who has died. Now, in the midst of grief, grieving people hear a lot of generalities. He was a really great guy. She always had a smile. I mean, they hear kind of generalities. What they long for is for you to put some meat on the bone of your memories of that person who died and share them with them. Now, if you write down this thing about the thing you remember about the person who has died, that's like doubly good, because they can come back to it a year from now, or when they get with other relatives who aren't there. They don't have to try to remember exactly what you said. They can share it with them, this story that you have written down. Be specific about qualities of that person. Be specific about something that happened that demonstrated those cherished qualities in that person. And the other thing that's a component of this, let me tell you, people have done this for me at times, and that is when you discover, and we all carry around cameras now with us 24 hours a day, right? So when you discover that you have a picture of the person who died that their loved ones might not have, give them print it out or email it to them or post it on social media. It's like giving, what they're longing for is that they could have one more experience with that person who died. And it's like you're giving it to them by sharing this picture with them that you don't have. Any of you who are here who have lost loved ones, you know that there is a painful reality that as time goes on, sometimes your memories, the way you picture that person who died, begin to be limited to the actual photos you have on them. It can be hard to conjure up mental pictures of the person who died. So when someone gives you a photo that they don't have, that you didn't have, of someone you love with other people in a situation you weren't in, it's just like giving them a gift of a fresh experience with that person who died. My son was cleaning out a closet. Although it's really messy again, I would just like to say right now. It's isn't it interesting how quickly that happens? But when he was going through these papers, one of his best friends from high school died of cancer about 3 years ago. And just recently he was going through this closet and he found these pictures of him with that friend. And so I said to him, you know what, and there were 2 copies of each. I was like, you really need to send some of those to Tim and Jennifer, the parents of this friend who died. And I said, why don't you just put a note in it about what a joy it was to remember that time with Ben. And that's going to make their day. It did make their day. It meant a lot to get that picture of an experience we had on spring break with their son that they weren't even there for. It was a great gift. All right, number 8. Grieving people wish you knew how much it means for you to simply be there at the visitation, the funeral, and beyond that. Sometimes I think we don't show up at those situations, especially when we know huge crowds are going to be there, because we think to ourselves, so many people are going to be there. They won't really notice if I was there or not. There's going to be so many people, so much confusion. It won't really matter if I was there. You know what? You remember everybody who shows up for you on the lowest day of your life. And maybe we don't go because we think I'm not that close. Maybe I haven't even seen him in 10 years. You know what? It's the people you haven't seen in 10 years who show up that mean the most. That they extended themselves on the hardest day of your life to be there, to acknowledge your loss. I will never forget, when I think about the hardest days of my life, it was probably the day I had to put my 2 children's bodies in the ground and walk away. That's hard. And I remember there on that day with hope. I remember looking up and seeing the faces of people I went to college with. Some who lived in town and some who didn't live in town. And somehow those faces meant the most to me. It was something about how we had shared this life 20 years ago, but now they were lifetime friends, and that they would bother to be there. They're still with me. They're still with me. That meant a lot. And then I remember on that day the awkwardness of walking up to that same grave a second time when our son Gabe died, and looking up and a group of about 9 or 10 fellow Bible study leaders with the Bible study that I had been in the year before. I hadn't been leading during that time of Gabe's life because we were focused on him. But here's all these Bible study leaders. And, they weren't people in my church. They weren't people who were regularly in my world anymore. And there they showed up together. And that's when I lost it. It meant so much that they entered in. And the other thing that goes along with this, if for some reason you really can't be there at the funeral, unless your reason was that you were on the other side of the world or in a coma, you don't need to give the person the reason why you weren't there, because it won't be a good enough reason. Instead, perhaps just say, I'm so disappointed that I couldn't be there. But I would love to hear from you if you'd be open to sharing with me some things that I missed. Would you tell me some parts about the service or about that day that were memorable or special to you? Because I feel so disappointed I didn't get to share it with you personally. Number 9, grieving people wish you knew how hard it is to give a report on how they're doing. But they do want you to invite them to talk about their grief and about the loved one who died. I have done this so many times. Sometimes I still catch myself doing it. I'll see someone who I know has had a loss or a difficult experience, and the first thing that comes out of my mouth is a very reasonable question, which is, how are you? It's a good question. However, let's put ourselves in their shoes. There's a difference oftentimes in the things we say or the questions we ask and how people hear it. You know that about communication, right? Sometimes when we ask a grieving person, how are you? What they sense is, I am being asked to give a report on my recovery. And what this person really wants to hear is that I am better than the last time they asked me. Their expectation is likely that here was this loss, and I should be on a steady path upward of being fixed, unaffected, better, no longer gripped by grief. And so it can sound like a time of confession if I'm not necessarily on that steady track up. When the reality of grief, the reality of how am I might be, no, I'm not getting better. It's getting worse before it gets better. That's the case for lots of people in grief. If you've been in grief or you've talked to people, it comes over you like waves. It's not a steady path of getting better. Sometimes we expect people are thinking, okay, it's been a year, so surely you're past it now. And they're finding the second year of dealing with the reality of grief was even harder than the first one, because now the reality is he's never coming back. I'm past all of those firsts in the first year, and the reality of this loss is gripping me like never before. So if we're not going to say, how are you? How are we going to approach that grieving person? Much better than how are you, which can sound like give me a report and it better be good, is to ask an open-ended question. Perhaps a question like this: what's your grief like these days? Now, do you hear the difference in that and how are you? For one thing, it assumes that they probably are grieving, rather than how are you might sound like, boy, I hope that grieving's over with. So we acknowledge it makes sense that you have lost this person you love dearly, that you would be grieving, and I'm inviting you to share with me what that's like. And they have the option of how vulnerable they choose to be with you in the midst of that grief. But that's a very open-ended question that invites them to share with you the realities of their grief. Maybe it's a question like, oftentimes I think about you on Sunday afternoons or Sunday mornings, and I wonder what it's like for you to come to church now without your husband. Is that a hard day, or what are the days or the situations you're finding especially hard these days? Do you hear the difference? It's a little more creative. It's a little more personal. It opens them up to share whatever they want to share. Another question might be, they're used to people saying, I'm praying for you. Why don't you say, a lot of mornings I get up and I think about what your day is going to be like, and I lift up the Lord in prayer. What's a way I could pray for you specifically at this point in your grief? Number 10, you thought I'd never get there. Grieving people wish you knew how much it means to hear from you on the anniversary of their loved one's death, or on their loved one's birthday, or on Mother's Day, or Father's Day, or their wedding anniversary. No matter how long it has been since their loved one died. I think one thing I didn't understand about grief before I walked through it, I remember right before I had Hope, this friend of mine at church's mother died. And I bought a card that I was going to send to her, and it just sat on my dresser for a while. And then after a while, I thought to myself, I don't want to send it because it's going to make me look bad. Anybody else relate to that? Like I wasn't quick enough on this. And so I just never sent her anything. One thing I didn't realize is pretty soon the cards stopped coming. And 3 months down the road, 6 months, 9 months, and I guarantee in the first year they're marking all of those. A year down the road to get a card, it's not like you were an idiot who was late. It's so welcome because it seems like nobody else remembers. It's never too late. Oftentimes cards sent late are the most cherished. So if you want to be a good friend to someone who's grieving, I highly recommend that in those early days, we all have electronic calendars now. Go to next year. Write on the calendar so-and-so's death date. And the next year, or 3 months from now, 6 months from now, whatever you want to mark, as that time is approaching, one thing grieving people will tell you, it's the leading up to those difficult days that's often harder than the day itself. So maybe that week before, that day before, or on that day, send a little note, send a text, send a little email, post something on Facebook that just lets them know that you remember, that you know this day is going to be hard. Because as they face that day, they're trying to figure out what to do with the day to remember the person who died. And some days, sometimes there's no energy for that, so they're just trying to figure out how they're going to get through the day. And for someone else to care enough to send a note or make a call or ask them to lunch or dinner, or to ask if you could accompany them to the grave. What a great gift. As I mentioned to you, David and I have this weekend retreat we do for couples who have lost children. And in this one session, we have this big board of just things grieving parents specifically face. And it's all these topics, kind of like a Jeopardy board. There are categories, and they choose one, and we talk about them. And David and I know now, we just had our 26th respite retreat. There's one card that always gets chosen. And that is the card that says birthdays, death days, and holidays. And it always gets chosen because it's always hard. And they're always trying to figure out. I mean, on the birthday of that person, maybe you can figure out something to do to celebrate that person's life. On a death day, it's really hard. Am I just going to go to work? Or am I just going to stay home, pull the covers over my head, and act like this didn't happen? But what could I do that would be at all meaningful in this day? So just know that's a really hard day. And what the smallest thing you do to let that person know that you haven't forgotten will mean a lot.